The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training grounds as a group of young cadets marched toward the mess hall. Their boots hit the pavement in perfect rhythm, each step echoing their pride and confidence. These weren't ordinary recruits anymore. They had survived basic training, passed their first evaluations, and now carried themselves with the swagger that came from believing they were becoming real soldiers. Leading the group was Jake Morrison, a 22-year-old from Texas whose father had served in the Marines. Jake's broad shoulders and commanding voice made him a natural leader among his peers. Behind him walked Marcus Chen, a quick-witted cadet from California who could disassemble and reassemble an M4 rifle faster than anyone in their class. Rounding out the group were Tommy Rodriguez from New York and David Kim from Oregon, both eager to prove themselves worthy of the uniform they wore. As they approached the mess hall entrance, they noticed an elderly man standing near the door. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and deep lines etched into his weathered face. The old man wore simple civilian clothes, faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. He stood quietly, seemingly waiting for someone or something, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that might have meant something to someone more observant. Jake slowed his pace as they drew closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the civilian on their military base. The other cadets followed his lead, their formation loosening as curiosity took hold. In their minds, this was their territory now. They had earned their place here through sweat, sacrifice, and determination. What was some random old man doing in their space? "Excuse me, sir," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority he believed his uniform granted him. "This is a restricted area. Civilians aren't supposed to be here without proper escort." The old man turned slowly to face them. His movements were deliberate and calm, lacking any sense of urgency or concern. When his eyes met Jake's, there was something unsettling about his gaze, not hostile, but intensely focused, like he was seeing things the young cadet couldn't possibly understand. "I'm waiting for someone," the old man replied simply, his voice quiet but clear. There was a slight rasp to it, the kind that came from years of shouting orders, or perhaps from inhaling too much desert sand. Marcus stepped forward, emboldened by Jake's initial challenge. "Look, old-timer, we don't know how you got onto this base, but you can't just hang around here. This isn't a public park. We're training to be soldiers here." The elderly man's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging what Marcus had said, but made no move to leave. This only frustrated the cadets more. In their limited experience, when they spoke with authority, people listened. When they gave directions, people followed them. This quiet defiance, this complete lack of recognition of their status, felt like a personal insult. Tommy, always the most impulsive of the group, took a step closer. "Did you hear what he said? You need to move along. We've got important training to do, and we can't have random people wandering around getting in our way." The old man's silence stretched on, creating an uncomfortable tension in the air. He wasn't being rude or confrontational. He wasn't arguing or making excuses. He was simply standing there, existing in a space where these young men felt he didn't belong. His calm demeanor only seemed to agitate them further. David, who had been quiet until now, joined in with a tone of exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a confused child. "Sir, we're trying to be respectful here, but you really need to understand that this is a military installation. There are rules and procedures. You can't just show up and stand wherever you want." The old man finally spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. "I understand where I am, son. I've been coming to places like this longer than you've been alive." This response struck the cadets as arrogant, though that wasn't how the old man intended it. To them, it sounded like this civilian was dismissing their authority, minimizing their importance, and refusing to show the respect they believed they deserved. Jake's jaw tightened, and he exchanged glances with his fellow cadets. "Listen, Grandpa," Jake said, his voice hardening. "I don't care how long you've been anywhere. Right now, you're on our base, and you're in our way. We're soldiers, and when soldiers tell you to move, you move. The morning air seemed to grow heavier as more cadets from other groups began to notice the confrontation. Word spread quickly in the way it always did among young military personnel. Here was something interesting happening, a break in the routine of their structured days. Soon, nearly 24 cadets had gathered in a loose circle around the scene. The old man remained perfectly still throughout this escalation. His breathing was steady, his posture unchanged. If he felt intimidated by the growing crowd of uniformed young men surrounding him, he showed no sign of it. This only served to frustrate the cadets more. They were used to their presence, commanding respect, used to civilians showing deference to their uniforms and their authority. Maybe he doesn't speak English very well, suggested one of the newly arrived cadets, with a snicker. Should we call base security to come collect him? Another cadet, emboldened by the growing audience, stepped forward. Or maybe he's just stubborn. Some old people get like that. They think they know better than everyone else, just because they've been around longer. The crowd began to close in slightly, not threatening exactly, but creating a more intimidating presence. The cadets felt empowered by their numbers and their shared identity as soldiers in training. They had been taught to project strength, to command respect, to never back down from a challenge. In their minds, this quiet old man represented exactly the kind of challenge they needed to meet head-on. The tension had reached a breaking point. Jake felt the weight of his fellow cadets' expectations pressing down on him. He had positioned himself as their leader in this confrontation, and backing down now would mean losing face in front of everyone. The morning heat was beginning to intensify, and sweat had started to form on his forehead, though he wasn't sure if it was from the temperature or the pressure of the situation. "All right, that's enough," Jake announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We've been patient, we've been respectful, but this old man obviously doesn't understand the seriousness of the situation." Marcus nodded in agreement, stepping closer to Jake's side. "We can't just let every random civilian wander around our training areas. What if he's taking pictures? What if he's gathering intelligence? We have a responsibility to protect this base." The suggestion that the elderly man might be some kind of security threat drew murmurs of agreement from the surrounding cadets. It gave their actions a sense of legitimacy that went beyond simple authority. Now they weren't just young soldiers flexing their muscles. They were protecting national security, fulfilling their duty, being the guardians they had been trained to be. Tommy, always eager to prove himself, took another step forward. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to place your hands behind your head and come with us to the security office. You've refused multiple lawful orders to leave this area." The old man's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his posture. It was subtle, so subtle that most of the cadets missed it entirely. His weight shifted slightly onto the balls of his feet. His hands, still clasped behind his back, adjusted their grip imperceptibly. To anyone with real combat experience, these would have been warning signs. But the cadets, full of confidence and training that had never been tested in real situations, saw only continued defiance. "Did you hear what he said?" David added, his voice rising slightly. "Hands behind your head. Now." The old man finally moved, but not in the way they expected. Instead of raising his hands in compliance, he simply shrugged his shoulders slightly, causing his loose t-shirt to shift. The movement was casual, almost dismissive, and it infuriated Jake beyond reason. "That's it," Jake declared, reaching forward to grab the old man's arm. "You've had your chances to cooperate." As Jake's hand made contact with the elderly man's arm, several things happened almost simultaneously. The old man's body moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone his age. Jake found himself off balance, stumbling forward as his grab met no resistance but somehow failed to achieve its purpose. In that moment of confusion, as the old man turned slightly to avoid Jake's clumsy attempt at restraint, his t-shirt sleeve rode up his arm. Marcus, who had been moving to support Jake from the other side, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes had caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, on the old man's weathered forearm, was a tattoo that Marcus recognized from his military history classes. From the documentaries he had watched as a kid dreaming of becoming a soldier, from the stories his grandfather had told him about the real warriors of the military. The tattoo wasn't large or flashy. It was simple, clean, and unmistakable to anyone who knew military insignia. The distinctive arrowhead shape with crossed arrows behind it, accompanied by the words, De oppresso, liber, the official motto of U.S. Army Special Forces. But this wasn't just any Special Forces tattoo. Below the main design, in smaller but equally precise lettering, were the words that made Marcus's stomach drop. First, SFOD, First Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Delta Force. Marcus had grown up on stories about Delta Force operators. These weren't just soldiers. They were legends. The most elite fighting unit in the American military. Men who operated in complete secrecy, who undertook missions that other Special Forces units couldn't even dream of attempting. They were the ones who hunted terrorists in the deepest caves of Afghanistan, who rescued hostages from impossible situations, who eliminated threats that posed dangers to national security around the world. And here was Jake, trying to manhandle one of them like he was some random trespasser. Jake, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake, stop. But Jake was already committed to his course of action. The failed grab had only made him more determined to assert his authority. He reached out again, this time with both hands, intending to physically turn the old man around and restrain him properly. I said, hands behind your head. The old man sighed softly, a sound that carried decades of experience dealing with young soldiers who didn't know what they didn't know. In one smooth motion, he stepped to the side, caught Jake's wrist, and applied just enough pressure to a specific point that Jake's entire arm went numb. Jake found himself on his knees, not sure how he had gotten there. His arm twisted behind him in a position that should have been painful but somehow wasn't. Jake, Marcus shouted, louder this time. But his warning came too late. Tommy and David, seeing their leader taken down, rushed forward to help. They had trained for situations like this. Or at least, they thought they had. They knew how to work as a team, how to overwhelm a single opponent with coordinated attacks. What they didn't know was how to fight someone who had been perfecting the art of combat since before they were born. The old man moved like water, flowing around their attacks without seeming to exert any effort. Tommy's charge resulted in him stumbling past his target and falling face first into the gravel. David's attempt at a tackle somehow ended with him flat on his back, staring up at the sky, wondering how his perfectly executed move had gone so wrong. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, and 3 of the most promising cadets in their class were now on the ground, completely helpless. While the old man stood exactly where he had been before, his breathing unchanged, his expression still calm, the crowd of cadets that had gathered to watch the show fell into stunned silence. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. They were young, strong, trained soldiers. He was an elderly civilian. The basic math of the situation should have been overwhelmingly in their favor. Yet here they were, watching their friends and leaders lying in the dirt, while the old man looked like he had just swatted away a few annoying flies. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. "Sir," he called out to the old man. "Sir, I saw your tattoo." The old man turned to look at Marcus, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his expression showed something other than patient tolerance. There was a spark of interest in his eyes, a recognition that perhaps not all of these young soldiers were completely ignorant. "Did you now?" the old man replied, his voice still quiet, but carrying a different quality now. It was the voice of someone who was used to being obeyed without question, someone who had commanded respect from people far more dangerous than a group of military cadets. Marcus swallowed hard, suddenly aware that every eye was on him. "First, SFOD, D, Sir, Delta, Force." A murmur ran through the crowd of cadets as the words sank in. Even those who didn't fully understand the significance of the designation could sense the change in atmosphere. The old man they had been harassing, the civilian they had tried to remove from their base, was apparently something far more significant than any of them had imagined. The old man nodded slowly, acknowledging Marcus's recognition. "That's right, son. I spent 25 years wearing that designation. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and more operations in places I still can't talk about than I care to remember." Jake struggled to his feet, his arm still tingling from whatever pressure point the old man had used on him. His face was red with embarrassment and confusion. "Just what?" the old man asked, his voice carrying a hint of steel now. "Just old? Just a civilian? Just someone who doesn't deserve your respect, unless I'm wearing a uniform and carrying a rank?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Jake opened his mouth to respond but found he had no words. Everything he had been taught about military bearing, about honor, about respect for those who had served, came crashing down around him. He had just tried to physically assault a man who had probably forgotten more about being a soldier than Jake would ever learn. The old man's gaze moved across the faces of the gathered cadets, taking in their shock, their confusion, their dawning understanding of the magnitude of their mistake. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but it carried a weight that made every word feel important. "I've been coming to this base for 15 years, he said. "Every month, on this date, I meet with the families of men who didn't come home from missions I led. Today, I'm meeting with the mother of Staff Sergeant James Wilson, who was killed in Kandahar in 2009 while serving under my command. She brings me pictures of her grandchildren he never got to meet, and I tell her stories about the kind of man her son was." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. The cadets who had been so confident in their authority just minutes before now felt small and ashamed. They had not just harassed a veteran, they had harassed a war hero who was honoring his fallen soldiers. Jake's legs felt weak, and it had nothing to do with whatever the old man had done to his arm. The weight of the old man's words settled over the gathered cadets like a heavy blanket. Jake felt his stomach turn as the full scope of what had just happened became clear. He had not only disrespected a veteran, but he had tried to physically remove a Gold Star family advocate from a memorial meeting. The shame was so intense, it was almost physical pain. "Sir," Jake began, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know. We thought you were just what?" the old man asked again, but this time his tone was gentler, more like a teacher than a commander. "Just someone who didn't matter? Just someone whose presence here was less important than your need to feel powerful?" Marcus stepped forward, his own face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, my name is Cadet Marcus Chen. I want to apologize for all of us. We made assumptions. We acted without thinking. We disrespected you and everything you represent." The old man studied Marcus for a long moment. "What's your grandfather's name, son?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "Sir, my grandfather is Chen Wei. He served in the Korean War with the 2nd Infantry Division." "I knew some men from the 2nd Infantry," the old man replied. "Good soldiers. Your grandfather ever tell you about what it means to earn your place in the military?" Marcus nodded slowly. "He always said that respect isn't given because of your uniform. He said it's earned through your actions, your character, and your willingness to serve others before yourself. Smart man, your grandfather." The old man's expression softened slightly. "What do you think he would say about what just happened here?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. His grandfather had immigrated to America as a young man, had served in the military to prove his loyalty to his new country, and had spent his entire life teaching Marcus about honor, respect, and humility. "He would be ashamed of me, sir. Deeply ashamed." Jake had been listening to this exchange, and something inside him broke open. All the pride he had felt in his uniform, all the confidence he had built during his training, all the authority he thought he had earned, it all crumbled in the face of this reality. He had bullied a war hero. He had tried to intimidate a man who had risked his life for his country more times than Jake could imagine. "Sir," Jake said, stepping forward despite his legs feeling like rubber. "There's no excuse for what I did. What we did. I've been thinking that because I'm in training to be a soldier, that makes me important. That makes me worthy of automatic respect. But I see now that I haven't earned anything yet. I haven't served anyone but my own ego." The old man looked at Jake with eyes that had seen young soldiers mature under fire, that had witnessed boys become men in the crucible of combat. "What's your name, son?" Jake Morrison, sir. Cadet Jake Morrison." "Tell me something, Jake Morrison. Why did you join the military?" Jake had answered that question 100 times during his recruitment process, during interviews, during conversations with his family. But standing here, in front of this man, who embodied everything Jake had thought he wanted to become, the rehearsed answers felt hollow. "I thought I wanted to serve my country, sir. I thought I wanted to be a hero, like my father. But honestly, I think I mostly wanted to feel important. I wanted people to look at me with respect." The honesty in Jake's answer seemed to surprise some of the other cadets, but the old man nodded approvingly. "That's more honest than most people would be. There's nothing wrong with wanting respect, son. But you can't take it by force. You can't demand it because of a uniform or a title. Respect is something you give before you ever receive it." Tommy, who had been silent since picking himself up off the ground, finally found the courage to speak. "Sir, how do we make this right? How do we fix what we've done?" The old man looked around at the faces of the young cadets surrounding him. Some were hanging their heads in shame. Others were looking at him with a new understanding. And a few seemed to be struggling with their own realizations about themselves and their motivations. "You start by understanding that being a soldier isn't about power over other people," he said. "It's about service to something bigger than yourself. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about making sacrifices so that others don't have to." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You also start by remembering that everyone you meet has a story you don't know. That elderly man you want to dismiss might be a veteran. That quiet woman at the grocery store might be a military spouse dealing with deployment. That teenager, who seems disrespectful, might have lost a parent in combat. You never know who you're talking to or what battles they've already fought." David, who had been mostly quiet throughout the encounter, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, would you be willing to tell us about your service? About what it was really like?" The question brought a small smile to the old man's face. The first smile the cadets had seen from him. "That's not a story for standing around in a parking lot, son. That's a story that takes time, and it comes with responsibilities." As if on cue, a car pulled into the parking area near the mess hall. Through the windshield, the cadets could see an elderly woman with silver hair and a black purse clutched in her hands. Even from a distance, there was something about her bearing that spoke of dignity maintained through unimaginable loss. "That's Mrs. Wilson," the old man said quietly. "James's mother. She drives 3 hours every month to meet with me, to keep her son's memory alive, to make sure someone remembers the man he was and the sacrifice he made." The cadets watched as the woman parked her car and began walking toward them. As she approached, they could see the small gold star pin on her jacket, the symbol worn by mothers who had lost children in military service. The sight of it made several of the young soldiers want to step back, overwhelmed by the weight of being in the presence of such sacrifice. "Mrs. Wilson," the old man called out, his voice warm with genuine affection. "You're right on time, as always." The woman smiled as she approached, and the cadets could see strength in her face that went bone deep. "Hello, Robert. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "These young soldiers were just leaving," Robert replied, turning back to face the cadets. "Weren't you?" It was clearly a dismissal, but not an angry one. It was the voice of a man who had more important things to do than continue educating a group of young people who should have known better to begin with. Jake stepped forward one more time. "Sir, before we go, I want to say something to Mrs. Wilson." He turned to face the elderly woman, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your son's sacrifice means everything to people like me. I'm sorry for your loss, and I promise you that I will try to become the kind of soldier he was." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears, but her smile never wavered. "Thank you, young man. That means more than you know. Thank you some more. Thank you subscribe.on. WeCanSubscribe.com. Thank you some more watching. Thank you subscribe.com. And then you commenting. We have no descended." One by one, the other cadets stepped forward to pay their respects to Mrs. Wilson. Marcus spoke about his grandfather's service and his commitment to honoring that legacy. Tommy promised to remember this day and what it taught him about real courage. David simply said, "Thank you," in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. But the sincerity was unmistakable. As the cadets began to disperse, Jake lingered for a moment longer. "Sir," he said to Robert, "would it be appropriate for me to ask what I can do to learn more about being a real soldier? Not just going through the motions, but actually becoming someone worthy of this uniform?" Robert studied the young man's face, looking for signs of genuine commitment versus mere words meant to make himself feel better. What he saw seemed to satisfy him. "There's a veterans hospital about 20 miles from here," Robert said finally. "They have a volunteer program. Men and women who served in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. They're there. And many of them don't get visitors. You want to learn what real service looks like? Go listen to their stories. Help them with their physical therapy. Sit with them when they're scared or lonely. Learn what the true cost of freedom really is." Jake nodded, committing the words to memory. "I will, sir. I promise I will." As the cadets finally walked away, their formation was different from when they had arrived. They moved more quietly, more thoughtfully. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked more like humility. They had learned something that day that no training manual could have taught them. That real strength comes from recognizing your own weaknesses. That true authority comes from serving others, and that the most powerful people are often the ones who have no need to prove their power to anyone. Behind them, Robert and Mrs. Wilson found a quiet bench where they could sit and talk about a young soldier named James, about his laugh and his courage, about the family he had left behind and the brothers in arms who still carried his memory. It was a conversation that happened once a month, every month, and would continue as long as both of them were able to make the journey. The cadets never forgot that day, or the lessons they learned from a quiet old man with a hidden tattoo. And in the years that followed, when they encountered their own moments of pride and assumption, they remembered the wisdom that can only come from true service and the respect that must be earned rather than demanded. "Sir," Jake said again, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and the backing of his fellow cadets. "This is your final warning. Leave this area immediately, or we'll have to take action to remove you ourselves." The old man's eyes moved slowly across the faces of the young men surrounding him. There was no fear in his gaze, no anger, no frustration. If anything, there was something that might have been sadness, though none of the cadets were observant enough to recognize it. He saw their youth, their eagerness, their absolute certainty in their own righteousness. He saw himself, decades ago, when the world had seemed much simpler, and authority had meant everything. "I told you," he said quietly. "I'm waiting for someone. I'll move when that person arrives." The standoff continued, with neither side willing to back down. The cadets felt they had established their authority and couldn't retreat without losing face. The old man felt no need to justify his presence to anyone, regardless of their uniform or their youth. As the tension built, none of them could have predicted how dramatically the situation was about to change, or how a simple glimpse of hidden ink would transform their understanding of exactly who they were dealing with.